Yeah, I'm not a huge Fanny Price fan. She gets on my nerves a little bit. I think, first off, I just happen to be a pretty good mimic. I thought, what if Fanny Price ran away from Mansfield Park? What if she just went, I can't take this anymore? I would say I'm more historical fiction than romance.
Hello, today I'm talking to Lona Manning, and this is part of the Regency History series of interviews with authors of historical fiction and also historical non-fiction. Regency History, the blog, we're very interested. I'm part of the Regency History team with my wife, Rachel, and we're very interested in the Regency period. So that's the sort of late Georgian, end of the reign of George III, and also the time of Jane Austen, which of course Lona is that's very much the time that you're writing about. In fact, Jane Austen, I think, inspired you. Is that fair to say?
Yes. I mean, I've always been in love with her language, with her way of writing. And then when I read more other writers of that period, I just realized I just loved the way people write and express themselves in that language. I love the cadence of it. I love the vocabulary. So I always thought to myself, I wonder if I can try and emulate it. I wonder if I could mimic it a bit, and always pushed it to the back of my head. And then finally one day I sat down and tried it.
It's a challenge, isn't it? I think to mimic
Yes.
the language. One of the
Yes.
things I think actually, I think Americans, this is my personal opinion, I've not researched too much into this, but I think actually you Americans have a bit of an advantage over us Brits, because only today I was reading a letter written by somebody in 1812, and this is a British officer in the army, and he was writing about he was writing to someone. He said, "I wrote to you from Lisbon." Now, a British person these days wouldn't say "I wrote to you"; they would say "I wrote to you." But I believe that "I wrote to you" is the sort of thing that Americans would say. Is that correct?
You're right. I think I'm now a Canadian. I was born an
Right.
American, so I'm bilingual. Yeah, I think I would say I wrote to you last week. I wrote you last week. People don't write letters anymore, so I couldn't
Well,
say.
yeah. Well,
I sent you an email.
yeah. Well, I've heard that the Americans talk about you, or seen it in text as well. "I wrote to you" rather than "I wrote to you." And there's other things like "gotten" and stuff. We don't say "gotten" in this, like in England anymore. But and there's phrases that I've seen pop up in material that's contemporary with Jane Austen, and Jane Austen herself. I mean, Jane Austen, from memory, I think used Z's a lot more in her writing than we Brits do these days, because we Brits, I think, I understand it, we were later influenced to put more S's in. So "realize," for example, became spelt with an S rather than a Z. But you Americans still use the Z more, or the Z, as well, I don't know in Canada whether it's a Z or a Z.
Yeah, we're Zetters.
But so I sometimes wonder that you guys across there actually, or certainly maybe it's the US rather than Canada, then has a bit of an advantage, because actually there's something about the language being in some parts at least, more related to the language that Jane Austen used. That's just a pet fad of mine, or pet interest of mine. One day I'll research it properly and establish whether there's actually any veracity in there.
Well, have you looked into, say, the linguists who study the Appalachian region, and how people think it's really close to Elizabethan English? And my Southern Illinois ancestors, oral history tells me they used the word "tup" to refer to female parts. And for example, Shakespeare uses that word in Othello. So there were some Elizabethans and anachronisms that remained in these early settlers. My ancestors were very early settlers that set the dialect and possibly even the accent of people in that region of Appalachia apart from the rest of the country, because they were so isolated. So it
Wow.
actually is a fascinating thing to delve into. Yeah.
It is, and actually I was put onto it, and I'll just come back to Jane Austen in just a moment and your books.
Yes.
But it's an interesting diversion. I was put onto it because years ago I was training some I used to do some software training, and I was training some guys from Spain, and we ended up talking about Mexico, and I said, "Oh, because they speak Spanish, I believe, in Mexico," and they immediately said, "Yeah, but they speak Old Spanish." What do you mean Old Spanish?
Wow.
And they it was the same thing. They said, "Yeah, Mexican Spanish is or South American Spanish even and Central American Spanish by their terms was old Spanish, whereas modern Spanish was what was spoken in Spain. So there's an interesting idea of language becoming slightly fossilized in the New World, which seems a bit of a contradiction, but there we are. That's an interesting diversion. And then if you're any linguists who are watching this or listening in on this, want to jump in with a comment, then please do when you're commenting on YouTube. Okay, so let's talk a bit about your books and Jane Austen and Mansfield Park. Now, I think your first email to me, you sort of said I probably wouldn't want to talk to you because I had referenced the fact that Mansfield Park is probably the least popular of the Jane Austen novels. I actually read Mansfield Park this year for the first time, and it's okay. I'm reading it more for the literature rather than for the story. Like for the story side, I think people have challenges with it as a romance. But there we are. But you're a fan of Mansfield Park. Is that fair to say?
I just found it was the book that I picked up and turned back to most often without even knowing why. Because we Jane Austen readers read and reread Jane Austen a lot. And I thought, why am I reading Mansfield Park the most when, I'm not a huge Fanny Price fan. She gets on my nerves a little bit. So why am I reading Mansfield Park as opposed to Pride and Prejudice, And I just, the way she tells the story, the skill that she unfolds the story and the way the characters reveal themselves through dialogue and the language, I guess, is what keeps bringing me back. Or maybe sympathy with the Cinderella character, even though she can be a little annoying. And sorry, go on.
But you did then realize why it was that you enjoyed it and why you kept going back to it.
I just found it, people talk about it being a comfort read and stuff, Jane Austen being comforting. And I think there's even studies where they've hooked people up to, brain scans, your brain on Jane Austen. And I have just found Mansfield Park the most comfortable to go and revisit. So I suppose the language has a lot to do with it.
So tell me a bit about your books. You've written a trilogy based upon Mansfield Park. Tell me a little bit about those.
Sure. A Contrary Wind is the first of the book, and I just had this idea, as I say, when I was teaching in China at a university in China, and I was rereading Mansfield Park, and I thought, what if Fanny Price ran away from Mansfield Park? What if she just went, I can't take this anymore, and she left? What would she do with herself? How could she support herself? And of course, the answer is she'd have to become a governess, right? I mean, she couldn't do a tech startup, so she would become a governess. And the story just started writing itself in my head. But then once I picked up the idea of writing about the characters in Mansfield Park, it also became about England at the time and the issue of slavery at the time, which of course is, I think, the number one thing people talk about in Mansfield Park is the slavery question. So I brought that into the story. And then somehow it became 3 books. And I just really enjoyed bringing in, putting my characters against the backdrop of real life events like a political assassination, the campaign to stamp out the slave trade, and the Luddite movement. And so I guess in addition to Jane Austen, another author who's influenced me a lot is George MacDonald Fraser and the Flashman series.
Yeah. Because
I just love the way he drops his characters into real history with real historical figures. So a bit of that is in my books too.
So you describe it as a Jane Austen variation or a variation on Mansfield Park.
Yeah. It's not a prequel or a sequel. Like the events just spin off in a different direction.
So is it fan fiction or is it historical fiction?
I think it could be both, but I'm not offended by calling it fan fiction because it is a tribute to Jane Austen, and I'm using her characters. And, by the way, I can certainly understand why some people dislike the whole idea of fan fiction. And I wouldn't really even bother trying to defend it to people that say, it's wrong and you shouldn't do it. If that's always going to bother you, and I'm not going to convince you otherwise. But all I can say is the book started writing itself. And as an exercise, I wanted to try and write a book in that style. And I also wanted to bring in what I thought were some things that are getting missed in Mansfield Park these days, which is that actually Mary Crawford is not the heroine, right? Actually, she's a pretty venal woman. So, and right now, she's a lot more popular than Fanny Price. So I wanted to amp it up a bit and make it clear that no, Austen did not write Mary Crawford as a heroine.
Right, great, and yeah, and that's a great thing to do. So, how important was the research to you then? Because obviously you're basing it upon Austen, so you've already got a basis there. So, how much research is actually needed?
Oh, yeah, research is hugely important. And I have a real fear of making some ridiculous mistake. And I was taking on things that I knew very little about, like the slave patrols, anti-slave patrols on the African coast. I was very intimidated writing about the age of sail and ships. I haven't, read a lot about it. And I was very worried about how about the steep learning curve to be able to write about that authoritatively. And I was at one time when I was writing that part, it was the last part I wrote, and I was at the home of an elderly relative. I was being his caregiver, couldn't get to a library, could only work with what I found online. Then I went to the community had this little cow shed that was been converted to a used bookstore. And I walked in, looked down, and there happened to be the one book that I knew about and that I wanted to find, called Bring Up the Chains. It was like, what? There it is right there. And so that book got me started, and I just couldn't believe the serendipity of that. Yeah.
That is amazing, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Yeah.
Of all the books in the world. Yeah,
Yeah. But as you say, there is so much online. I mean, I'm actually researching the Navy right now for something that we're doing for Regency history, and there are some fascinating first-hand accounts, and you can get them through Google Books and through other places like that, and you can just download the entire version, and they reward a good read, because that and by reading the original sources, then obviously you're reading the words of the people who were there at the time, because I guess for what you were doing, you're researching not only the history aspects, like you said about the slave patrols, but also the language itself. I mean, some of the things that people say about your books, I've got a couple of quotes here. So you've got Manning's style is so Austinian, if that's the right pronunciation, Austinian. Manning's style is so Austinian that I'm second guessing the possibility of reincarnation.
It's quite a compliment.
That's a compliment, isn't it? And somebody else has written, well crafted, meticulously composed, and richly researched. But a lot of people talk about your ability to replicate Austen's language, and so you're researching not only the history, but also the language side. So how did you approach researching the language?
Well, I think first off, I just happen to be a pretty good mimic. When I was a kid, I used to read Rumer Godden. I think if you know the name of that British author. And then I'd sit down and I write something and I realized, oh, this sounds kind of like the way Rumer Godden writes, without even knowing what I'm doing, without even knowing the grammar of it. But I've since then learned the words for some of the things that, or the specific techniques, Johnsonian cadence, or the way that they wouldn't say, I think this will make you happy. They'll say, I think this will not make you displeased, right? They'll do a double negative, right?
Yes.
So there's some little tricks you can do to sound more of that era. And then you've got to read enough to pick up on the vocabulary. For example, that they wouldn't say there's news from France, right? They wouldn't say it like that.
Yeah,
they'd say there's intelligence from France.
Yes.
So the thing is, though, if you haven't bathed in enough old language, maybe you don't realize that phrases like okay or get up in your face, right? Or whatever are more modern. And luckily you can check that kind of thing with Google Ngram and find out when a phrase came into use. So every now and then when I'm not sure, I'll pop on and check. But I think really the only way to be comfortable with the vocabulary is like you do and like I do and like your wife does, is read a lot of original sources.
Absolutely.
And just bathe in the language. And
Yes.
luckily I love the language, so that's just fine. Yeah.
And when you were reading back through your draft manuscripts, did you ever come across an expression, a turn of phrase that we would use now, and then a little light bulb go off and think, oh, actually, was that something that they said back then?
I think the word hello, right? It brought up that they don't say hello very much. Yeah, they say good morning, right? Or good day. And hello came along with the telephone, right?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. So that would be one example. Mm-hmm.
Little things like that, and there's a whole range of other, but other terms. The other day, because my wife and I were often talking about things, and the phrase "what the Dickens," and of course, what the Dickens? Well, you actually immediately assume that has to be post Dickensian because it talks about, but actually it's not. Apparently, it was actually it's recorded being used before Charles Dickens was around. So there we are. So some phrases can catch you out.
That's true. That's true. You can be certain that, oh, no, that can't be right. And then you look it up on Google Books, like I like to do, put in my phrase and then put a time as well, to find out. And oh, they were using that phrase back then. Yeah, Google Ngram or Google Books.
Yeah.
And just as an older person, I remember when I was, maybe 24, I wanted to write a novel about, what's her name? Betsy Patterson, I think is her name, who married Jerome Bonaparte, Napoleon's brother. She was a girl from Baltimore. And I thought, oh, that would make a really neat story. But here I am in British Columbia, Canada. And how do I find out about, say, the native flowers of the state of Maryland pre-internet? To go to a library and say, I want a book about native flowers in Maryland, and it just got tedious really fast and I gave up. So I mean, I just love the internet so much, and I love how much can I scrape out of the internet sitting at home in my bathrobe, and find the most obscure person or the obscure thing possible, whether it's in an old newspaper clipping or through an old book or whatever. It's just an amazing thing to me. I never cease to be grateful for it. Yeah.
It is amazing what we can access these days, and well done on being that thorough. I mean, I've spoken now to a number of American authors, North American authors, who have put North American mammals into the English countryside in their novels and been published. I mean, my wife and I laughed about this a while back, a couple of years back, because she encountered somebody running into a chipmunk on the road in England. Well, we don't have chipmunks on the road, and we didn't have them then, and we don't have them now. But also, I think raccoons have come up, and I think some other North American mammals as well. That they just don't roam free in the UK.
Or I think Americans call it a sycamore, but you call it a plane tree. There's a few different names for. Or do you use the word sycamore too?
We use the word sycamore, but whether we use sycamore and plane are interchangeable, I don't know. I'm not that hot on trees, but of course, but it's intriguing.
We would check.
but of course, there's a whole load of flora, well, particularly trees and plants that the Victorians imported massive amounts from around the world, and so these things just didn't grow in Regency Britain.
You've got to put yourself in that mindset of what am I taking for granted here? What am I assuming that might not be the case? Yeah.
Yeah, and we have to make some assumptions as well. We have as we're going through this. So, did you make any mistakes? Is there anything where, in hindsight, you think actually, and you're happy to admit to, obviously, where you think actually I didn't get that quite right?
No, nobody's brought anything to. Nobody's written in to tell me that I got anything wrong factually, and I did ask some British people to beta read once I learned what beta readers were, because again, I had no idea about writing a novel and what people do nowadays, especially when they're self-publishing. And I didn't, but I got, I learned by, again, going on the internet and finding a community, you know. But I was wanting to circle back, and when you and I are saying how we feel about accidentally having anachronisms in our books, maybe, I mean, how important is it? I mean, it really, we want ours to be just dead on accurate in every way. And if you were reading someone else's book and you see them having someone who, say, like attends a ball right after their father has died, or someone who has a curate sit down at a big luncheon hosted by a duchess, and that curate proceeds to take over the conversation and lecture all the women there about their womanly duties. Does it make you stop, like bring you up cold? Or, is it just are we purists? Is it bad to be a purist, I guess, is what I'm asking myself and asking you.
Well, that's good, because that's pretty much the next question I had to ask you, which is, how important is it to the reader that we are actually historically accurate? So you're answering that, you're asking the same question, and it's a good question to ask. I mean, you look at the popularity of something like Bridgerton. Now, we watched a little bit of Bridgerton, but only enough to tell us it really wasn't what we wanted to watch. And other things like that, where the producers of Bridgerton are quite open. It's a Regency fantasy. It's not meant to be how it was. But of course, a lot of people would view it as it's history. It looks like history. They're wearing gowns. They're going to balls. It must be history. But at the end of the day, how important is it to the reader that the history is right?
Yeah. Bridgerton's actually, I haven't watched Bridgerton. I watched a little bit of Sanditon, so I'll get those two mixed up. So when I shuddered when you said Bridgerton, I have absolutely no beef against anybody watching a program that, as you say, advertises itself as a fantasy. And I have no beef, as long as we're talking about visual stuff. I'm fine with colorblind or color bent casting. It's the acting that matters to me. So I'm just fine with it. But Sanditon, I think the mere thought of it's gotten me so distracted. So it obviously bothers me a great deal, but could I even say why? That I find it so distracting and so annoying that something that purports to be a history story has got big clunking anachronisms in it.
Well, you're right. I mean, Sanditon, we watched the first series of Sanditon, and yes, we're increasingly in despair as it went through. But people enjoyed it, and obviously,
passionately.
And what people love is good stories. And at the end, there's a famous quote: "You never let the facts get in the way of a good story." And that applies I think it was it was in the newspaper world, I think, but it was also applies equally well with film and TV and books as well. At the end of the day, are you telling a good story? But
and if I want to brand myself as a writer as someone who does a lot of research and brings the reader something that's as historically accurate as I can make it, then you could just say that's a selling point that I have. And I hope to find an audience that it's important to them. But if it isn't, I shouldn't be a big snob about it, Yeah,
you're right. And the audience thing is important, because there are people out there, us included, who will read something or see something. And yes, we are brought up short by an obvious anachronism. My wife devours many more Regency romances than I do. I've read a few, but she is, let's just say, often exclaiming, and then I ask her why, and she tells me, "Oh, well, they wouldn't have done that, or that wasn't possible, or this is just." And of course, one of the challenges with writing about the past is that actually anything could have happened in many cases. Now, they wouldn't have picked up a cell phone or a mobile phone in Jane Austen's time, because it wasn't physically possible. But there's things that would have happened. Could a woman dress as a soldier and go into the army? Well, actually it did happen.
Mhm.
But a lot of stuff, and similarly in the Navy, there are women serving as ratings in the Navy, dressed as men. So these things did happen. So outrageous things actually happened, and outrageous things happened, I'm sure, that aren't recorded. So you can get away with them, I think, in fiction. It's just you need to get the historical facts right as well, to satisfy those of us who are a little bit more pedantically inclined.
Yes, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know if it's a virtue, but as long as we have our own community, and
Absolutely.
it gives us a lot of pleasure. So there you go.
So tell me a bit about your approach to research. You've already given some sort of insights, but
Yeah. Well, I do prefer original research. For example, in the debate over slavery, you go back and you discover that slave owners were not twirling their mustaches and cackling about, isn't it great that we can oppress people? No, they were making these justifications, and they were saying this is why it's necessary. So, and I had encountered that before when reading about the American Civil War and what the plantation owners said about themselves. For example, Uncle Tom's Cabin, that entire book is the talking points of view of the South and the North put into the mouths of characters. And the writer of Uncle Tom's Cabin, she puts it in their dialogue. And I put a little scene like that in the first book, where one of the characters is explaining to Fanny, the justifications for slavery. And I thought to myself, I wonder if anyone's going to freak out if I have this character saying these things and nobody comes up and punches him in the face, or no one comes up and challenges him on it. Just put it in as an explanation without also putting in my authorly condemnation of it, right? And because I'm here to explain things, and so far, again, that's the scene where I haven't caught any flack for that yet. Just saying, this is what they thought, folks, and this is how they justified it. If you want to know more about it, here it is.
Yeah, I mean, if you wanted to make your hero historically accurate to the time, for the Regency period, then many of his attitudes, and indeed her attitudes as well, to many things, including slavery, but not just slavery, would be radically, radically different to our attitudes today.
Mm-hmm. And that's another thing that brings me up short in a historical novel is, I think the word for it is presentism, right?
Yes.
I'm bored out of my mind. At my age, after going to university during the height of the radical feminist movement, honey, I've heard all of that and I'm so bored with it. And then, so if I open a novel and the heroine is balling up her fists and going, I will not be auctioned off like a prize heifer, and I refuse to get married. I'm just so tired of historical novels that have the feisty heroine, rejecting the marriage market. It just seems to me such a cliched trope. I've been there, done that. So you got to know attitudes as well as vocabulary and some of the facts. Yeah,
absolutely. Have you seen the new adaptation of Persuasion?
Yes.
which opens with Anne Elliot swigging wine from a bottle.
Yes. Maybe there was some cute things in there, like a playlist, a little joke on a playlist, and she's got a sheaf of music. But it wasn't Anne Elliot, right? And likewise, the two most recent Mansfield Park adaptations, they just go, well, we can't have this wimpy, mousy doormat of a heroine. We've got to slice her out of the story and insert a feisty heroine. Yeah. And also feisty, like, I don't even get that, because, a neurotic, self-pitying heroine is not, in my eyes, a feisty heroine. But that's a rant for another day, maybe. So about the research, I just wanted to really mention about how grateful I am that, although I graduated from university in the late 70s sometime, I was able, as an alumna, to get digital access to SFU Library through the internet. And so anyone who is interested in research, and if you have a BA or any if you went to university, and if you haven't done this, contact your university library where you went to university and activate your student account. And, I can come across the mention of an article or a book, and boom, 30 seconds later, I've got that book or article. It's just fantastic. So I'm really, really grateful. I wasn't so impressed with the education I got from my university, but finally my tuition fees are paying off in terms of the access to their library.
That's a great tip. I wonder if that works in the UK. Maybe I should write to my university and say, can I access? Because I spent hours and hours in the history section of the university I went to, Southampton. Most of the time I spent, I was reading material not related to my course. Again, because I just loved history, and I just love reading, particularly the original sources. That's probably one of my biggest lessons from university, was discovering that actually there were primary sources. We're
talking about this with such animation and delight, like the thrill of being deep in the stacks in a library, satisfying my Richard III obsession or whatever it is I'm doing. And maybe other people will like, I do not get this. I do not understand why you're so excited about tumbling down research rabbit holes and picking up a book and thinking maybe no one's opened this book for a long time, or how many people have listened to this voice that spoke 200 years ago, and now I'm reading this article, that maybe has been really forgotten, but it's still here. The thrill of it. For me anyway, and for you too, I think.
Well, absolutely. I mean, if my ideal day off, day out, whatever would be, it wouldn't be going up a mountain or going down to the beach or something like that. Where I live near the beach and I like mountains, but yeah, put me in an archive with lots and lots of old documents, or at least copies of old documents, and I just have hours of fun reading through them and just hearing those voices from so long ago, and not so long ago as well. I mean, anything that happened before now is history. But particularly the area that I've chosen to specialize in is the Regency. Because that's the area that my wife's always loved, and so I love all of history. Well, let's specialize in one area. It's Regency.
Oh, and I sent you a photo just a few minutes ago just as you were going online. That is, to me, is one reason why the Regency. It's not, for me, it's not the dresses. Like, I look like a fat lady in a nightgown, in a Regency gown. It is the curve.
So this is a graph. If I really can get myself organized, I'll put this on the screen so anyone watching it on YouTube can see. It'll appear up here somewhere. So and it's GDP per capita in England. So that's gross domestic products. That's economics, and it shows the fact that GDP, so the gross domestic product, the amount of income, I guess, being generated by people right from the medieval period along right through the 1600s and 1700s was really quite low, and then in the time of Jane Austen, and level, well, it's got tiny ups and downs, but but then the time of Jane Austen, so the late 18th century, early 19th century, suddenly it starts to go upwards, and then it really rockets during the Victorian era, and then of course right now it's really skyrocketed. But it is a fascinating era. The Industrial Revolution was just getting going. I mean, Jane Austen, I don't think in any of her works particularly alludes to anything that's happening with regards to technology, but the technology side of things was really just getting going. Steam engines and that sort of stuff. Obviously, Britain was also at the time in a huge war, vast war with 23 years. I think Britain was at war with France, and war is a time of innovation. So the military was advancing as well.
And you had the tensions between the Enlightenment and the Romantic movement happening right then. And there's Jane Austen right at that intersection, And it's very, very, I'm going to sound dismissive here, but very fashionable now to look at the past exclusively through the lens of race and class. And I like to look at the past through the lens of human progress and technology and try to work it into my book very, without pounding people over the head with it. But I'm very much interested in, when we're sitting at the top of that GDP skyrocket, as you say, it rocketed up, and looking down at the people, oh, they should have been better to women and slaves. Well, it was just very much a different world with a lot fewer material resources to go around. And, we just, to judge from our comfortable prosperity, things like famines and being harsh to single mothers and all the things that happened back then, I just think people today could use a little think about looking at things through the lens of economic progress, and not just the lens of we're better than they are, which seems to be very current right now.
Yes, it's very hard, isn't it, to get the perspective on the past. And we have to remember that Jane Austen's era as well. And we talked about the technology. A lot of the technologies being used in Jane Austen's era were technologies that the Romans had been using 2,000 years before, almost. Not a lot had changed in many ways. It was still a largely horse-driven economy. The population also massively exploded as a result of the changes. So yes, that was a very important era in terms of history, in terms of technology, and yes, our perspectives. It's very hard to see the world in the same way that the folks around Jane Austen would have seen the world, because just so much has changed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, from child mortality to all sorts of things you could mention. Yeah,
absolutely. So, are you planning to write any more, Lona?
I keep thinking I am, but we were talking with Brenda S. Cox a little while ago, and I think the same thing happened to me. Is I start researching something, and I got so into the research, then so the last year I've been writing nonfiction. I've written a few articles that have appeared in Jane Austen's Regency World, and something in the online journal Persuasions of the Jane Austen Society of North America. I've been sharing what I've been finding in nonfiction articles, and I'm still so engrossed with all of that. I would like to get back to trying my hand at a novel again and trying to write and do better, based on the feedback I've received about, I don't know, plot arcs and character development and, things about that I just didn't know about when I wrote my first book. So I'd like to take another crack at it sometime. And I know I don't have forever, but I'm just enjoying the research so much and sharing my ideas on my blog, sharing what I've discovered on my blog, which is why I'm wearing my pearls today, to remind me to mention my blog, Clutching My Pearls. So like a hidebound old reactionary looks at modern Jane Austen scholarship, and I've read well over 50 forgotten novels of the period. Because another way to do research into people's attitudes, is what were people saying in novels? What were they writing that appealed to their readers? What were they hung up on? You can really learn a lot by reading these silly old, and some of them are silly, these old novels. Yeah, yes. And they're on Google Books for free.
Absolutely. And of course, the novels that were popular at the time of Jane Austen were not Jane Austen. I mean, her novels sold, but she wasn't one of the most popular authors of her time. And a lot of the other novels haven't stood the test of time. But that's often, I think, because they were more opinionated. There was a lot of moralizing and morality preaching effectively through the novels.
Absolutely, way more didactic, and the characters are yes, you're quite right, and more melodrama in a lot of them than Austen chose to put in. More attempted abductions of the heroine from a masked ball, and Austen always chose to put that off stage, I should say. The duel between Knightley. Pardon me, not Knightley, I'm saying the wrong, the duel between Colonel Brandon and, adultery. It's
Yeah,
all,
yeah,
and my theory for why she does that is more that she is a comic person and she doesn't write about something really serious without relapsing into laughter. And she says that of herself, right? In that famous letter to the Prince Regent's librarian, I can't talk about a big grand subject without laughing.
yeah.
So my theory is that that's why you just don't have the melodrama in her novels. I end up putting more melodrama in mine, so I guess I don't have that. I don't have that problem. Yeah.
Excellent. And so just remind me, so you've written the trilogy, and I think there's also another book, isn't there? The book.
Yeah,
Percy
the
Shelley.
blue one is Shelley, and yeah, research. Like, you know, when you get just obsessed with a topic, and you're like, oh, you know, you're ordering books, out of print books, because you can't get them any other way, and you know, what do you going from knowing nothing about something or finding it very confusing to finally getting to the stage where you're going, no, that's not right. You know, you're finally like really learning a topic. So with Shelley and the Unknown Lady, I took a true life mystery from the life of poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, and I dropped Mary Crawford into it. So it's about a child that was born in Italy when Shelley and his wife Mary Shelley were living there. And I just became really fascinated with Shelley's personality. Love his poetry, but yeah, he had issues. So, and that's not a happy romance novel. And I do tend more, I would say I'm more historical fiction than romance.
The romance, right.
Yeah, which is why I don't have couples in a clinch on my covers, because I want to be sure that people don't read the book and get angry with me, right? Because, you know, you have to send a signal that this is not a romance, or I don't emphasize the romance so much.
Yeah. Cover art is so important. That's a discussion for another time.
Yes.
So what would your tips be? So somebody's watching this interview or listening to this interview, and they would like to start writing historical fiction, or they want to have a go at writing a Jane Austen fan fiction, whatever you want to call it. And there's nothing wrong with fan fiction. I mean, to me, if you want to write anything, write. The most important thing is that you write, rather than that you worry about whether it's okay to write it or not. So what would your advice be to somebody like that?
Don't use the word steed. Don't.
It's very specific.
Yeah. You're right. So are we talking more about sounding like Jane Austen?
Well, any tips that you want to share, really?
Okay.
I'm open, Lona.
Okay.
Go where you want to go with advice.
Okay. So for research, I think you and I agree that a great place to start is Google Books. And in the drop down, when you're on your search, you can limit your search to a range. So I usually put in 1780 to 1820, and then, you know, I might put in a phrase that I think people might have used back then. For example, if they were talking about slaves in the East Indies, they might use the phrase wretched creatures. So type in wretched creatures in quotes, and up comes, you know, people talking about that. But actually, you could even start with Wikipedia, because that will, you know, give you some leads to follow, right? And it's all online. Check with the university you graduated from, as I mentioned, fantastic source of books, because if an interlibrary loan, librarians are wonderful human beings and they live to help you. And so if there's a book that your library doesn't have, ask if you can get it through interlibrary loan. And there are online resources. I've got a page at my website there's the Jane Austen, I always lisp and stumble on this word, thesaurus.
Sounds like a dinosaur, thesaurus. Yes.
Yes. But you can look up and see if Jane Austen used that word, and you put it in the blanks. And you can also, I think they, there's several, there's sites where you can actually compare your writing to Jane Austen. And I've got the links on my webpage, on my website. If you want to take that on, but I would really advise people you see some people trying to do it, and you can just tell that they're in the they're in the deep end of the pond and they're struggling like to sound authentic. It's, if you are not familiar with that vocabulary, then, be kind of careful. I'm a teacher of English as a second language. That's my second career. That's why I was in China. So I just love, that helps you explore the English language more. You were talking about the Spanish, their language is more Latinate, where our language is like a sandwich, right? Between the Norman French and the Anglo-Saxon. And Jane Austen was writing in the higher levels of Norman French, of Latinate words, right? Not the Germanic words. So, it would be, if that is a revelation to you, if you don't know about that, maybe it's really interesting to learn about. So understand the level of vocabulary you're working with there.
That's intriguing, and I'm not a linguist particularly, so that's interesting. But what I would say is that decide what voice you want to write in and what style you want to write it. And if you want to write a Regency romance or a Jane Austen-esque type book, and you want to write it in your vernacular, that is to say the words that you use every day right now in 2022, that's absolutely fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But make that make that your style. Don't try and compromise. There are some books where you're reading it and it's really written in a very contemporary fashion, and then suddenly it drops into something which it just feels wrong because they're putting the word steed in, for example, and and it's
or prithee or methinks or it's like, no, sorry. And again, I guess I'm sounding like a snob, but it's just such it's if you love the Regency, then I hope you would enjoy cracking open Boswell's Life of Johnson and just enjoying that language, Georgian era language, and just spend some time with that language. And if you're really serious about it, I can't think of any substitute for doing some reading of the original stuff, right?
Absolutely. And if you're stuck for plot ideas, you think, I'd love to write, but I'm stuck for just read some original journals. And there's loads of them on Google Books, journals from country pastors and soldiers and sailors and a load of other people. Just read some journals and read some of the stories that they tell, things that happen to them. There's loads of story ideas in there.
You're right, like runaway heiresses and all sorts of good stuff, stories that deserve to be rediscovered and told.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Lona, it's been great talking to you. Thank you very much for your time. Where can people find you online?
My website is lonamanning.ca for Canada. And on the website, I've got more about my books, and I have my blog, Clutching My Pearls. So I'm also on Twitter at Lona Manning, just Lona Manning. And I've got a Facebook page, but I don't do very much on it, and that's called A Contrary Wind.
Excellent. So go and visit the website. Look up Lona on Twitter. Say hello. I'm assuming you're happy for people to get in touch and say hi.
Very much so. I've hidden my email on there somewhere because, Lona Manning at Shaw.ca, I believe it is one way to find me.
Yeah.
Maybe people can write in and tell me what a snob I am.
Write in and ask Lona questions. I mean, she's been on a writing journey, and so you've been a teacher and you've been writing things for a long time, but the novels are very new to you, aren't they?
The urge to write. Yes. Do you get the urge to write?
Yes. Absolutely.
Yes, the itch. I've had that since I have a child. Maybe you have too. Yeah. So, but as I say, I always thought that I didn't know how to write fiction, and so then I wanted to try it, and we'll see if there's more from where that came from, but not Mansfield Park, because there's no market for it.
Excellent. Well, Lona, thank you very much for giving us some time today. It's been fascinating to talk to you. It's great insights, great inspirations, and so thank you very much for your time.
It's been a real pleasure.
And you're, I think, 8 hours different from us here in the UK. So as the sunset, or the sunset actually over here quite a while back, your day is still just getting going. So have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you so much.